All right, so we'll get underway, guys. We're fortunate to have Professor Bruce Wilson with us this evening to give you a rundown on the European Union. Bruce is from the RMIT European Union Centre, so has got a vast background and knowledge of the kind of stuff that you're interested in. So over to you, Bruce. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Doug. And Doug asked me to say a bit about myself, which is always a bit challenging, but I guess I've been in and around universities and industry for most of my working life, and that's, I guess I've been at RMIT since 2003. I spent a decade before that working at an applied research centre on organisation and technological change, and in the last decade I've worked a fair bit on the question of university relevance. How what's the place of universities in the modern world? And I've done a lot of that work with European partners, and in particular with regional authorities dotted across the world. So that was kind of a useful background to have, I think, when I came to take up the job as director of the EU Centre. The EU Centre was established at RMIT in 2010. You probably don't know that there are 3 EU centres in Australia. You probably don't know that they're an outcome of a competitive process. The EU lets a call, as it does with so much of its funding for projects, and institutions in our case apply, and RMIT was successful. We have a range of responsibilities which include academic, teaching, research. We have a role in mobility, in promoting movement between staff and students, between RMIT and European colleagues, and we have, perhaps most importantly of all, a role in outreach, in promoting the EU and in promoting collaboration between Australian researchers and European researchers and businesses in Australia and businesses in Europe. And that's kind of close to my head right now, I guess, because I've spent the day with what's called the French Researchers in Australia Network, FRAN, which is a kind of a network that's co-sponsored by the French Embassy in Australia and the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So I've had a pretty good day, I'd say, talking about why there are French researchers in Australia and why there are French companies in Australia and what the state of relationships is, and we'll perhaps have a little bit of that later on. So you're off to Europe. How many of you, I assume you've all been to Europe before? Most of you have done that? No, a couple haven't, so that will be a new experience for you. It's one thing going to Europe, it's another thing knowing something about the European Union. No, I'm interested to ask you and get your sense of it, because I think we as Australians, I think we know a lot about Europe. Most of us have some kind of family ties to Europe and have travelled there and feel like it, like it in some ways we have a connection to it. But I think the level of ignorance generally in Australia about the EU is absolutely overwhelming. And so those of you who feel confident enough to say something here are the exceptions rather than the rule. And I think there are some good reasons for that. I mean, one is that it is a complex beast. The second is that we have a media in this country which is essentially sees Europe through Fleet Street's eyes. And those of you who know anything about the history of the relationship of the UK with the European Union will understand why that's not necessarily a positive thing to have. And it's scarcely that you ever see an article in the press or an item on the news that's not in some way coloured with criticism. And the simple reality is, I think that we've never ever anywhere in the world seen anything like the effort that's being made in Europe to establish a supranational regional entity that is, as you put it then, quite correctly, in fact, as you've all said, it had its origins in that drive for peace, but is now very much about global competitiveness and about how the European Union can engage with that. Now, I've got some slides to go through. They will take as long as they take. To be honest, I've got no idea, because that's really going to depend on you. You will interrupt me whenever you feel free. Okay, ask me questions, comment, whatever you want to do. And you can be guaranteed that whatever we discuss and talk about in the next hour or 2 or 3 we'll have barely scratched the surface of what could be said. So, you know, whatever you take from tonight, you'll have a hell of a lot more to learn. And I can only wish that I was in your shoes, because I'd love to be going to Grenoble for however long you are, and if you're spending a longer time in Europe this time, then make the most of it, because I think it's a pretty extraordinary place. And I say that as somebody who kind of mirrors what I just said in myself. You know, I think I first went to Europe probably 30 odd years ago. Lost track of the number of times I've been through work mostly, and have learnt 1,000 times that in the last 3 or 4 years about the EU compared to what I knew beforehand. So, you're on your way. As all good lectures should do, we'll start with something that's a bit light and trivial, just to get you into it. All European countries are European, but not all European countries are in the EU. Name one that's not.
Switzerland.
Thank you. Another one?
Norway?
Yeah, they're two prima facie examples, but they leap straight out at you. Member states, if you get anywhere near the actual formal operations of the EU, we talk about them as member states. It's important language because you raised the issue of sovereignty. The whole exercise of the EU is about a growing process of learning about sharing sovereignty. No member state of the EU will ever say to you that they have given up their sovereignty. What they are doing is coming together, sharing sovereignty in order to address problems which they perceive to be shared problems, shared issues, shared opportunities. So the notion of being members of the EU and still states is crucial to how the EU operates. The ideals of unity, solidarity, you can see I'm wearing my lapel pin of the EU flag, just in case you hadn't seen it before. But you'll see anything on to do with the EU Centre, we have the EU flag on there. There is an anthem for the EU, which is Beethoven. EU Day, 9th of May, commemorates a famous speech by the French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman, where he articulated the ideal of a united Europe. Next May, for those of you who are in Melbourne, we'll be partnering with Alliance Francaise, the Goethe Institute and others to put together what we're referring to as Europe Week. We're going to have a series of activities which are in different ways acknowledging and celebrating the place of the European Union. And again, bearing out my first point about the notion of the member states united in diversity. Yes, the EU is very much, it's a European Union, but in no way is there an assumption or a view that will in some way lead to a homogenisation of the EU. It's very much about respecting and retaining the diversity. And you know, we're talking about a significant chunk of the world's globe, but its neighbour, Russia, is an important part of a larger story about what Europe's place in the world. The EU Centre at RMIT, we're funded through a grant from the EU with co-financing. What else would I say about that? Not much, I think we'll move on. What is the European Union and why the European Union? 28, I should have asked you that question, shouldn't I, rather than just showing you the slide. Who the most recent member of the EU is?
Latvia?
No.
Moldova?
No.
Bulgarian.
No.
Croatia.
Bingo, very good. Twice the woman on the left. Croatia joined on the 1st of July 2013. Bulgaria and Romania joined in 2007 and a raft of Central and Eastern European nations in 2004. So that's the kind of the recent history of expansion. And again, just put that in perspective. You've got the early formation of the coal and steel board, I think 57 from memory. We'll check that on the slide in a minute. So you've effectively got 50 years in which there's a steady process of 15 countries working out what it means to come together. Suddenly that number's almost doubled. And not only is it doubled kind of just as a simple expansion, you're bringing in 13 countries which bring a completely different political heritage, economic standing and so on and so forth. So this last 10 years, it's not surprising that it's been a remarkable period of development for the EU, because there's been a hell of a lot of learning It's not just been more of the same, 15 to 28, it's a completely different challenge in terms of absorbing these additional 13 countries. And not the end, of course. Ongoing process of negotiations with Turkey, very tricky in the latter part of last year, because the EU has a rotating presidency. So each member state holds the presidency of the EU for a 6-month period. And the latter part of last year, the second half of last year, Cyprus held the presidency, the smallest state in the EU, and it wasn't recognised. Cyprus doesn't recognise Turkey's claims over the Turkish part of Cyprus. Turkey doesn't recognise the existence of Cyprus. So it was very difficult to take negotiations for Turkey's membership of the EU so long as that presidency was in order. And in fact, I think there's a pretty common view that Turkey has no chance of joining the EU so long as it holds the position of not recognising one of the existing member states.
Yeah, I was just going to ask what your opinion was, if you think Turkey would ever be able to join the EU or not.
Ever's a long time.
Yeah.
So the short answer is probably, I think. But when it does, we probably won't recognise the EU, and you won't recognise Turkey either. So I would say that there's a pretty inexorable logic about it, but it's quite possibly not in my lifetime anyway. And as you said right at the start, I'm sorry I don't know your names, but I don't think I'll even try and remember at this stage. But as you said at the start, it's very clear. Primary reason for existence was peace. When the EU ambassador spoke at the launch of our EU Centre in May 2010, the key message of his speech that night was about the importance of peace in Europe, and that's continued to be a driving force. It's I think part of the mystery and challenge of the EU, that the way that they can make serious mistakes and yet continue to grapple with the learning around those mistakes. I'm referring particularly to the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. You talk to any European who's involved with the politics of the EU, the diplomacy of the EU, and there's an enormous sense of regret about what happened in that period of history. I've never heard anybody speak about it without some sense of perhaps shame might be too strong, but certainly regret at the incapacity of Europe to step in quicker than it did in that set of conflicts. That agenda of peace remains a fundamental part of the identity of the EU. There's a lot more that could be said about that, by the way, because as you'll see in a minute, one of the key moments for the EU was the Treaty of Lisbon in 2010, and one of the outcomes of that treaty was the establishment of the European External Action Service. You might know the old joke that Kissinger used to say that you knew that if you were going to ring Australia, in the last government, then you were ringing, you wanted to ring somebody to do with foreign policy, then you rang Bob Carr. But if you wanted to ring Europe, who did you ring? There was nobody to ring. Well, since 2010, there's been an answer to that question, because they have a high representative for European external affairs. That's Baroness Catherine Ashton, and she heads up a whole new part of the apparatus of the EU called the European External Action Service, and that, you will have seen in the last 12 months or so, has been a platform for her to be very active in a whole range of what you might call peace-seeking activities in the European neighbourhood. Egypt, Iran, Ashton has been a key figure in those negotiations. Not necessarily, perhaps often not the most influential, but certainly a key figure. And part of the balance that's being worked out at the present time is what's her role as the person that Kissinger might have rung, vis-a-vis the fact that each of the member states still has their own foreign minister. So it's part of as I say, the mystery and the intrigue of the EU is seeing how those dynamics work their way through. Milestones. This is obviously a bit selective. You could probably put together a number of other key dates that would be important. But I think the kind of the message that flows through this list of dates is that there are two important messages. One is there kind of have been waves of EU evolution, a period where a fairly decisive decision has been taken. There's been a period of years, even a decade, of the working through of that decision, and then another significant step and a period of time of working through the implications of that decision. One of the things that's dogged the EU throughout its history has been expectations that it would collapse. You can see that most recently in the responses to the fiscal crisis, to the issues around the euro. You could go back to the early 90s and look at the economic crisis at that stage, and you could look before that at a range of other incidents in that previous period. The prevailing logic amongst EU officials, and I think generally in Europe, generally, not the UK, but generally in Europe, is that the crisis actually strengthened Europe. What you get from a crisis is not less Europe, but more Europe. And in the same way that the Maastricht Treaty was a key outcome of the early 90s crisis, so there's an assumption, certainly, or perhaps assumption's the wrong word, a resolution that the outcome of the current process will be a stronger phase of EU development rather than a weaker one. I won't go through the individual dates there, but feel free to ask a question if you want to. 3, 2, 1. Yes.
Just to do with the euro, so you've got 17 countries in the euro and 11 without. Is there a game plan to get the other 11? I mean, UK I think are a big holdout, but apart from that, is there a game plan to get the other countries into the euro, or are there some that are just holding fast?
The short answer to that is no, but you'll notice when I show you a slide in a minute that most of the Eastern European countries are not members at the present time, and I think it's inevitable that most of them will be. There's certainly an assumption if you've joined the EU in this last round that you would at some point join the Eurozone. That doesn't apply to the members who existed prior to 2004. Once you're in the Eurozone, there is no get-out mechanism.
So there was some, I think, when the euro was introduced, were given an opt-out. They had no obligation to join it. So I think that's now the new ones sort of have that. Well, if you're going to join in, you want them and everything.
Again, just testing my memory, but I'm pretty sure that Britain and Denmark were the two who were most vocal. Not the only ones, obviously, because you can see from the others who have not joined, but Britain and Denmark were the two who were most vocal about not giving up their currencies. In Sweden, again, some of you might know better than I can recall, I'm pretty sure the Swedish government has always been in favour of joining the Eurozone, and the Swedish voters have rejected that when it's been put to them. But don't quote me on that, but I think you've got those kinds of debates going on around the edges. Now, this is where the EU gets very, very interesting, and probably for some of us very, very boring at the same time, because this just gives you some sense of the complexity and the what's the significance of the apparatus that the EU has put in place. One important little stat to keep in mind at this stage is that in all that I'm about to say, the EU costs 1% of EU GDP. So it's actually a very small part of the overall, sorry, do I say GDP? It's 1% of government expenditure in Europe. So it's in fact, a small part of the overall decision-making apparatus. Member state governments and bureaucracies continue to be much larger than the EU, and to put that in perspective still further, the EU bureaucracy is smaller than Centrelink in Australia and the French Ministry for Culture. So we're not talking about a huge apparatus, but it's a complex apparatus because it provides the mechanism for that process that I mentioned before of sovereign states sharing sovereignty and working out how to come together and deal with issues of shared interest and concern in a way that's going to be effective for them. So again, I'm not even going to begin to try and kind of be specific about the detail, but the legislative process involves three key partners. The European Commission, which sponsors legislation. It's the European Commission that actually puts forward a draft piece of legislation for consideration. It then goes to the Council of the European Union and to the European Council, and I've left out of that the European Parliament. The European Parliament is obviously a key part of the decision-making, and as one of you said, just to be clear, European voters are directly represented in Parliament. The European Parliament is elected in the same way as we elect members here, and it's always interesting because of the tension that can then pose between member state governments, which of course are elected by the same electorate, and their representation in the European Parliament. The European Parliament has 6 political parties in it, broadly reflecting kind of centre-right, centre-left, with some exceptions to the margin, but it doesn't quite map onto any one member state. The European political parties reflect amalgamations of what you'll find if you look across the particular member states. Council of Europe, let me just be clear about this. The European Commission is, if you like, the public service part. That's the employed bureaucrats who are your civil servants, if you like, of the EU. It's an incredibly competitive process to become a member of staff of the European Commission. Minimum of fluency in 2 languages, and typically people would be highly educated, a minimum of a master's degree. The Commission, the European Commission itself, it has 28 commissioners in it, 1 from each member state, and they have portfolios allocated to them by the President of the European Commission, who is appointed through a process that's managed through the European Parliament. So there is a President of the European Commission, currently Manuel Barroso. His term expires in May next year, so there's a process underway of politicking about who might be the next President of the European Commission. The Council of the European Union is the body to which the presidency that I referred before applies. So the presidency of the Council of the European Union is held by a member state. And intriguingly, the Council of the European Union meets on average 16 times a month. And you might say that was overkill. What the Council of the European Union is a series of representative meetings of the member states where a particular minister from a member state will attend the Council of the European Union for the matters that are relevant to their portfolio. So, for example, once a month, the Council of the European Union meets with, for example, the environment ministers from the 28 states, and their agenda will be framed around matters to do with EU business in relation to the environment. It will meet as the social affairs ministers. It will meet as cultural affairs ministers, and so on and so forth. So that's one of the things I personally find extraordinary, to think you've got that kind of process of decision making rolling through every month, 16 times a month. That body's meeting and is supported by the different parts of the European Commission to do the business that relates to the legislator of that section. The European Council is a recent phenomenon. It was appointed it came into existence out of the Lisbon Treaty in 2010 as a mechanism to deal with one of the underlying tensions that existed between the Commission and Member States, and that is to do with the representation of the heads of state, with the Prime Ministers specifically, of each of the Member States. So the European Council is in fact a very important body, even though its process in the actual decision making of the EU is less well defined than the others. But it gets its significance because it virtually operates almost by veto. If you can't get the support of the European Council at the end of the game for a particular piece of action or legislation, not least the budget, then it's not going to happen. So the European Council is the heads of states. It has a president. In this case, it has a president for 2.5 years, appointable for a further 2.5 years, and the president, it's the former Belgian Prime Minister Herman van Rompuy, is the president of the European Council. So you've got the president of the Commission, you've got the president of the European Council, and then you have a president of the European Parliament, who at the present time is Martin Schulz. Schulz might be one of the front runners for the presidency of the European Commission, except that he's been a very active president of the Parliament, so he's probably managed to rub a whole lot of people up the wrong way. And then you've got the presidency of the Council of the European Union. Are you with me so far? all on board? So it's a lot of fun, I think. Like it just strikes me as being, you can see why I think it's such an extraordinary attempt. You're talking about 28 sovereign nations choosing to pool part of their sovereignty in order to establish the entity that is Europe, a European Union. And then there are these other things. The Court of Justice is, as in our system, it's the other point of the checks and balances triangle. The Commission, the Parliament, the Court. The Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of Regions are committees of the Parliament, but very powerful committees in their own right. And they have direct representation. MEPs obviously are elected by voters, but the committees then bring in another layer of representation from key authorities throughout Europe. So the Committee for Regions is essentially comprised of the representatives of regional authorities throughout Europe. And again, one of the intriguing things about Europe, if you're going to talk about the longer term, is the relationship between regional authorities and the European Union decision-making itself. A raft of regions have their own offices in Brussels, and so whereas you might think that if Catalonia, for example, wants to do business with the EU, it would be doing it through the Spanish government and the Spanish government relationship with Brussels. Catalonia has its own office in Brussels and is actively lobbying and engaging in Brussels business on behalf of Catalonians. And I don't know the actual number, but my guess is that there would be at least 40 or 50 regions that have their own offices in, about 40 or 50 that I could nominate myself, that I know of that are in Brussels in their own right. Kent's probably, Kent is the largest English county, but the Kent office in Brussels is a very active place, for example. Now the investment bank and the central bank, probably for a fair period of time the investment bank was more important than the central bank. The central bank seemed to have a relatively obscure role tucked away in Frankfurt, but obviously in the last 3 or 4 years the ECB has come to play a much more prominent role, and in the evolution of the new wave of EU relationships and decision making, I think it will continue to be important. I mention these key policies here just because they are fundamental to the way in which the EU does its business and is known. Regional policy, it's an area of research that our centre has made a particular commitment to, looking comparatively at regional policy in the European Union, Asia and Australia. It's significant because when you go back to the 70s, it was a recognition that for the European community, as it was at that stage, to evolve and to prosper, something needed to happen about the level of disparity in living circumstances across the different nations that were part of it at that stage. And so regional policy was kind of conceived of as a bit of a transfer mechanism to certainly address issues of infrastructure, but otherwise seek some measure of compensation to the poorer regions in Europe, so that they could play a stronger role within the European community framework as it then was. That's evolved through a number of different phases and a lot of very intense debate and argument. the EU has just resolved a budget for the next 7 years. Again, you may or may not know that the EU works on a 7-year budget cycle, not 1 year or 3-year parliamentary cycles. It's a 7-year cycle. 2014 to 2020 is this next iteration, and they've only just done the deal on it a fortnight ago. It's been over a year of very intense negotiation. But out of that, out of the total EU budget for 2014-2020, 34% of it will be spent on regional policy. And what's interesting about the evolution of regional policy is that it's now primarily committed to an agenda around what's talked about as smart specialisation, as about the initiatives that will be taken in a regional context to build the capacity of regions to address the EU agenda of smart, sustainable and inclusive. Common agricultural policy clearly has been a central part of how, and I think you mentioned the agricultural subsidies that were central to the CAP a few decades ago. The CAP also has evolved a lot over recent decades, and in the next budget period, I think the number is $375 billion on common agricultural policy, about 37% of the EU budget for that period, and it's very much targeted at addressing sustainability issues. Without question, the agricultural policy builds in a level of a platform, if you like, for European agriculture that underpins it. But it's about sustainability, and it's about global competitiveness. Smart, sustainability, inclusive are the key words, the slogan, if you like, that attaches to EU 2020, the overarching strategy that the EU is working to at the present time. But research and innovation, the notion of being a knowledge-based economy, is central to the EU's understanding of the future of Europe. And again, in this budget that they've just finalised, 30% increase in funding for research. So I think the number off the top of my head is something like $87 billion over the next 7 years on research. And increasingly, that research agenda is open to third country partners, such as Australians, providing they can demonstrate that what they want to do is going to contribute to the knowledge economy in the EU. And international development. The EU, as an entity, is far and away the largest funder of international development aid in the world. I think, again, from memory, it's about 25% of all development aid is provided by the EU. And interestingly, they increasingly do that on a cooperative basis. There's a relationship now with AusAid, so that AusAid manages EU aid that is going to be spent in the Pacific. The EU manages what AusAid there is that's going to be spent in Africa, because that's the principal focus of a lot of the EU action activities. So not only is it an important part of what they do, it's another good example of how they act very much on a basis of kind of global citizenship. Schengen area, just again, this is yet another dimension. Again, what is Europe? What is the European Union? We've already established that there are 28 member states. Only 17 of those are part of the Eurozone. I talked in passing about the funding for research. What I didn't say at that time is that there is a European research area which includes a number of non-EU states, including Norway and Switzerland, and I think Israel. I think Israel, do you know Doug? I think Israel's part of the European research area. So that they're very, what's the word, kind of pragmatic, I guess, almost, when it comes to working out who's in and who's out of different kinds of activities. Schengen is clearly about movement, about mobility across borders. Again, relatively recent, 1985, 22 of the member states apply. You'll see it doesn't include the UK and it doesn't include Ireland. And the reason why Ireland doesn't subscribe to Schengen is because of their relationship with the UK. It's more important for the Irish to have free movement with the UK than it is with the rest of Europe. If the UK signed Schengen, Ireland would follow them within within moments, and again the 3 associated countries, including Iceland. Again, some of the things I've got on the slides here may or may not be relevant to you, but if you're planning to stay after your study tour component, some of the things about visas are just worth, you just need to keep an eye on some of it, especially if you're going to stay for longer than 3 months. You need to be very careful about what you've done. Passport, student visa, again, some of this may or may not apply depending on what you're wanting to do. If you haven't thought about the practicalities, do so, because everybody's got a story about somebody who forgot to do something or got mugged or whatever. So just here's the Eurozone stuff. There's the Eurozone members there. You can see the list of countries. Somebody mentioned Latvia before. Latvia is very keen. If I had to guess, it would probably be the next likely member of the Eurozone, but probably still a way to go yet. Again, interesting things. The notes are identical, but each country has its own coins, one with a common side and one with a local side. ATMs and ledger back note. Again, things you probably all know, but if you don't, give it some thought. Phone calls, again, you're probably all on top of that stuff, but I have to admit I've learnt the hard way. I kind of always knew that work was going to pay for my data roaming the first time I went for a professional call, so I didn't bother about it too much. Then I got the please explain from upstairs, and I've been very careful about it ever since, so I can speak from personal experience that you do need to pay attention. The exchange rate's really moving around, but I checked it yesterday, and yesterday it was $1.49. God knows how it's gone out to that again, but no doubt it'll move around again in the next couple of weeks. But just be careful if you're not already alert to that. And if you haven't got that in perspective, then it's a big place, but it's not that big. So this whole debate we're having about Turkey and about Russia helps to put that into that map, puts it a little bit into perspective. It's a big geographic area, but not that big.
The thing that gets me with this is that we talk about population in Australia, about how our population is growing out of control. Then you sort of look at that and realise there's about 500 million people in that area. Yeah.
Well, I think the French today was saying that it's the density is 16 to 1. I think density of people in France compared with Australia is 16 to 1, something like that. Okay, so just finish off a little bit about Europe and Australia. Europe and Australia. Have you heard of ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting? This is one of those interesting global initiatives, again, that the EU has sponsored over about 20 years now. It comprises all the EU member states plus a range of Asian countries, and it's a quite important forum for dialogue between European and Asian nations. Heads of state meet as a group once every 2 years. The last meeting was in Vientiane 12 months ago. The previous meeting was 2 years before that in Brussels in 2010. The significant thing about that 2010 meeting is that it was the first time that Australia, at that 2010 meeting, Australia, New Zealand and Russia were added as members. So until 2010, we had tried to join ASEM about 3 times beforehand and had been knocked back at different stages. And I think one of the things that's worth noting is the impact that Kevin Rudd had when he was elected Prime Minister. You might remember that one of Rudd's unusual decisions, not long after he became Prime Minister was, you probably don't know actually, if I was to be honest, that I'll ask the question, who did Kevin Rudd appoint as the Australian Ambassador to the EU in the latter part of 2008? No? It's always good to ask, isn't it? Brendan Nelson. Who was Brendan Nelson?
He was the opposition leader.
The opposition leader. Got rolled by Turnbull. Did he? I think
Yeah.
he was rolled by Turnbull, and then Turnbull was rolled by...
He was the first opposition leader after Howard.
Yeah, that's right. And so he was rolled pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, Turnbull was never leader.
Never leader. Who was the leader after?
Abbott.
Was Abbott?
No, Turnbull was leader. He, I'm pretty sure Turnbull was.
No.
Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't argue with you. I don't remember, but I thought there were two opposition leaders before Abbott got it. So I don't remember who the second one was. Anyway, Rudd appointed Nelson, surprisingly, as the Australian ambassador to the EU, and I think Brendan Nelson turned out to be a remarkably good choice, and he has done a very impressive job of shifting a whole lot of aspects of the tension that had existed between Europe and Australia. He either got them out of the way, dealt with them, or he managed to get them onto the back burner. But there were two critical things. The first was that one of the first things that the Rudd government did was sign up to Kyoto, and that had a big impact in Europe. That was taken to be a very serious shift in the orientation of Australia to the rest of the world. And the other thing that the Australians stopped doing through Nelson was whinging about agricultural policy. That was one of the things that they just parked and put to one side and said, we've got a raft of other things. And they successfully negotiated, even in some of that same ground, the wine agreement, so that Australia stopped using French names on wines and came up with a set of geographical descriptors and wine descriptors that would be recognised and able to trade in the EU. He clarified and addressed a number of the issues about Australia's relationship with NATO, because he was also the ambassador to NATO. But Nelson himself says that there was a palpable shift in Europe in attitude towards Australia in that period, which he doesn't claim credit for it. It's to do with the different position that Australia adopted in regards to things like climate change and being a part of the world community. And so in 2010 we were invited to become part of this club. Heads of government meet every 2 years, and the significant thing about that probably is not so much what happens in the meeting room, but what happens in the corridors around it. It's always an opportunity for a lot of bilateral and informal conversation amongst leaders that might otherwise be difficult to have. But underpinning the heads of government meeting, there are regular working groups, and there are regular ministerial meetings. So quite apart from the heads of state, ASEM meets again at a number of other times across that intervening 2-year period to deal with issues. It has no decision-making capacity whatsoever. Nothing that ASEM does ever has a consequence in the way that perhaps the UN decision-making does. But I think it's increasingly seen to be a very important vehicle for multilateral negotiations between the two entities. One of the things, again, if you are interested in the politics of the EU as a supranational regional entity, is what does it have to share with ASEAN or with ASEAN Plus? ASEAN Plus from 2015 is going down a considerable distance down the path towards opening up free trade amongst its members. What does it learn from the EU compared to what it might take, as being its own experience? In fact, you find a raft of political science scholars that are pondering that question. Alongside that, ASEM's a vehicle for those kinds of conversations to occur, and so we're part of that. There's a lot of debate about what is the status of the EU as a trading partner for Australia? Still, because if you look at the official statistics of Australia's trade, it still separates out the individual member states. So that Germany is the number one partner in Europe for Australian trade, but the UK is the number one source of and source to foreign direct investment. When you bundle it all together, at least in services, the EU is probably Australia's major trading partner still, and even if you take into account goods, it's certainly in the top 2 or 3, alongside China and the US. So the existence of the single market is very important for us, but not well recognised, even in business, let alone in the general populace. One of the outcomes of Australia becoming part of ASEM in 2010 is that meeting in Brussels was used by the then Prime Minister Gillard to promote the prospect of elevating the diplomatic relationship between Australia and the EU. That was agreed to by the EU, and so for the last 3 years now there's been a lot of work going on developing a treaty level diplomatic agreement between Australia and the EU. It's still not finalised. There's one clause which I believe has held it up for something like 18 months now, and I believe that clause is something to do with retrospectivity around human rights that the EU is hanging on to. I don't know the detail of it, and I haven't been able to get anybody to talk about it. But a central theme of the relationship is science and technology partnerships. It's very clear that Australia is a valued partner in science and technology activity by the EU, but quite what that's going to look like in the next period is still a bit unclear, because we don't have the rules for the new funding agreements, and the pattern has been that Australians can be part of bids for EU research funding. They can get money which will allow them to participate, to travel, to communicate. You can't actually get money to do research here from the EU, and it's not clear yet whether that will change. And my last dot point, France and Europe. You're going to France. It's very interesting. France is the 5th largest economy in the world. Australia is the 12th largest economy in the world. But if I check my thing, I think we are respectively the 30th export destination for France, and France is the 49th export destination for Australia. So it's quite an odd statistic, isn't it, that two relatively large economies have relatively little to do with each other. And as I mentioned where I was earlier today, the president of the French-Australian Chamber of Commerce spoke very eloquently about the waiting opportunity that France and Australia have got a lot stronger relationship to develop together that they're not taking. He used in his talk today a lot of data on innovation, which essentially argued that both Australia and France are very strong in knowledge and technology resources, but very poor in application. We don't have good relationships between researchers and business, researchers and industry, and we certainly don't have the kind of international collaboration that would enhance that. So, that's the end of my slides.
Professor Bruce Wilson, thank you very much for your time and your knowledge.
I hope it's useful.
Most enjoyable. Thank you.
I'm envious, as I say. Have a great time. It's always interesting. Thank you. Send me a postcard and tell me how you're finding it.
We'll take a short break and back in here just for a few minutes to wind up, and then we'll call it a night.
Great.
All right. I sent a copy of the 3 assignments to Grenoble so that they'd be aware of our interest areas, and they've come back with a response which is really good. They're supporting the kind of information areas that we have identified. Doing business in Europe, our MBA program director will cover introduction to EU decision-making institutions EMS, Euro, single market, EU competition and its impact, EU trade policy and its impact, EU business models, how can an Australian company do business with Europe with a focus on French firms? So again, tailored to what we've asked for. Understand the discrepancies and common points between Europe with a focus on French markets and French business. Review concrete examples of EU and French external and internal commerce, European economy, finance and markets, import-export in the EU, customs tax issues, intra-community trade, goods and services, labour costs and law, and VAT, value-added tax. And again, down that EU business model track, successes and challenges posed by past and future European integration, and a number of projects, cultural diversity in the EU, introduction to key European business models, and how they reflect cultural diversity. So covering Germany, France, Netherlands and the UK, the principal players. And then the conclusion outlining possible strategies to successfully engage with the EU for non-EU countries. So that's Australia. There's an HR speaker coming along. They're planning to ask an HR corporate vice president from STM or ST Microelectronics, thanks, Doc, who could give an interesting testimony on European and worldwide HR problems. Also talk about cultural aspects of management and leadership, focus on HR in France and HR practices in France. And there's a tentative schedule here, which I run a copy for everyone, so if you wouldn't mind passing those around. Make sure you take one of those each, that's the more up-to-date one.
Do you have the name of the CTM speaker?
I don't, no. What it says is we are planning to ask an HR corporate VP, so it doesn't specify who.
Thank you.
And for the company visit to Rossignol, need date of birth, passport number, place of birth, country of birth and nationality. So, what's the quickest and best way of getting that? You wouldn't have your passport numbers with you, would you? Okay. Your assignment is due on the 19th, so do you think you could put that information on the front cover? Yeah. So let me list those again. And this also is up on the website.
So I think we had to fill that information in for Chris. There was a form, we put all that stuff in on the website, including passport number.
Chris has got that. Okay, look, I'll ask him that.
But you want to be anyway on the side?
Look, I think it's going to be, at least we know then that I've got it. Yeah. Okay, so date of birth, passport number, place of birth, country of birth, nationality. So this response is also on the web, so we're on Blackboard, I should say. And
So just to confirm, date of birth, passport number.
date of birth, passport number, place of birth,
Yep.
country of birth,
Yep.
and nationality. And Celine sends kind regards from a cold Grenoble, -3 degrees this morning. So take your winter woolies with you. Yeah. Now, I'd like to get your assignments back to you. We'll probably initially try and digitise them. I'll be writing on them just to give you an indication. It just won't be a blank grading. I'll try and put down as much helpful comments as I possibly can. Reading through your assignments, you'll be aware that it's pretty open-ended, isn't it? I mean, you need to work out a whole range of things yourself, do a broad brush to begin with, and as we were discussing earlier, work out what the best options are going to be and then start to rate the options so that when you get to Grenoble and you start hearing the presentations, you've got some focused questions to ask the presenters. You're not sort of generalising and not getting anywhere. So once you start getting into this, the question is, where do I stop? Have I gone far enough? Have I gone too far? And so on. So these are the challenges that what's becoming known as design thinking are all about. So what we're trying to do is to set you that challenge, which you would, probably many of you have had that challenge already, to know what the question is, to try and understand the question and the person behind the question, so that you are giving that person what that person has asked for. So there's no point in charging down a track that's off to detours. You need to make a judgment about what is appropriate and what's relevant and what's not. And the best way of doing that is to go back to your aim every time. If you've got a problem with that, and there are a variety of answers, and you stay and go down detours, wasting a lot of time, bring yourself back to your aim. Is it relevant? If it's not relevant, don't do it. Come back on track. I started to say that if you could just put your name and address on one of these envelopes each, I can then photocopy in a desperate last resort. I can photocopy your assignments, pop them in the envelope, and know that you're going to get them. Okay? So it's a last resort measure, but who knows what's going to happen to IT between now and the time I need to get these assignments back to you, which I would aim to get back before Christmas. But also, course guides part B here, there's one each. So again, if you just pass those back, if you would like to take one, please do so. I'll be away, I'm heading off to Canberra tomorrow. I'll be away for the rest week in Canberra. I'll be at ANU. So I'll be back on the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, Monday the 16th. So it'll be 3 days before your... Alright, so any last questions, anything apart from the blackboard? And we'll call it a night. Of course, you're welcome to start if you want to chat about